Wars. Some very brief remarks on that. Then from there, I'm going to really move on to neighboring part, you might say, of Asia, namely Japan. We want to look at briefly at what's happening in Japan in the mid-19th century. And then we're going to broaden out the picture to try to understand the phenomenon of migration. We're going to get to that, I hope, in about 15-20 minutes, but I want to sort of have you start thinking about it right at the outset, even while I'm speaking about the Opium War and Japan. Very recently, the New York Times had an article with implications that are really quite stunning. This is about 2-3 months ago. They did a long-term study, and they determined that the majority of Americans in their adult life will live within 20 miles of where they were born. The majority of Americans. Now, I want you to think about that, because the segment that we're going to be turning to after we're done with Japan and China is a segment having to do with migration, right? Global migration in the 19th century. We're going to look in particular at 2 or 3 different strands. One of them is immigration to the United States, because this country is, of course, defined by immigration. There are not too many countries that you can say are defined by immigration. This is a country of immigrants. That's largely true of Australia. It's largely true of Canada, Brazil, Argentina. Right? But of course, the United States holds a different place in the world's imagination than any of these other countries. And this is one reason why, of course, some people are extremely agitated by what's going on in the US today, with various attempts to deport people, various pronouncements by the Trump administration, so forth and so on, right? Because in some ways it gets to the heart of what the US is. So that's one strand that we're going to look at very briefly, as immigration to the United States in the 19th century, something that of course continues down to the present day. And secondly, we're going to look at Indian indentured labor, because that will help us understand a very different strand of migration. Whether we want to call it migration in the same sense in which we speak of migration to the US is itself an important consideration, because of course people leave under very different conditions. Some people leave of their own accord, some leave under persuasion, some don't know where they're going, as we're going to find out. And we're going to look briefly at immigration to a different part of the Americas, namely Brazil. Right? Now that's what is entailed there is movement. And I think all of you will agree with me, whatever your view of exact or precise view of the matter, you will agree with me that most Americans, if you ask them, they would say that yes, we are an extraordinarily mobile people. You know, people move around. People go to college 2,000 miles away from home. And that's something that is really commonly not done in most countries. It's commonly not done in most countries. You know, if you're born in Paris and you go to college, you're likely to go to University of Paris. Now, I think that, of course, I mean, if you remember that the very first week, the second class I took a poll everywhere on how many of you were born in California, how many of you were born outside the country, and we're finding that increasingly, of course, in a state system such as this one, a significant percentage, if not the majority of the students, are actually from California itself. But nonetheless, on the whole, this is a society that has been extraordinarily mobile. And yet, and this is what makes that statistic so extraordinarily interesting, we find that the majority of Americans in their adult lives will live within 20 miles of where they were born. Actually, they took a more precise measurement. And that was, they're going to live within 20 miles of where their mother is. You know, all right? And not the father, because the understanding is that, you know, in the event of a divorce, children are more likely to remain in contact with their mothers. Of course, women also outlive men. So if you're talking about much older Americans, if they're living in close proximity to one parent, it's usually the mother. You know, all right. So what we're saying is that after moving around here and there, people come back to where they're from. A majority of them. Now, if this is happening in this society, what will we be able to say about other societies? And perhaps we should rethink whether Americans are in fact as mobile as we've assumed them to be. Right? That's So think about that. However, that's the next segment. I just want you to sort of start thinking about it, because at this juncture, where are we? At this juncture, we were in the 1830s in China, a war with Britain, and you recall that the last thing I mentioned to you, that the first Opium War, 1839 to 1842, the British, the population of Britain is 7 million at that point in time. I mean, it's minuscule in comparison to China, which has a population of something in the neighborhood of around 400, 425 million at this point in time. But of course, the British have a superior military technology, vastly superior, and this is where you have to now go back to, of course, such things as the Industrial Revolution to see how Britain did become the power that it was already by the 1830s, 1840s. It's really not going to be until around circa 1900 that Britain is going to be outstripped by countries such as Germany, and eventually, of course, the United States. But certainly for that period of time, those 6, 7, 8 decades that we're talking about, 1830s, moving into around the 1890s, about 1900, Britain is the dominant industrial power of the day, right? In this war, these British gunboats are going to be able to really demolish the Chinese junk boats that you have. You know, this is one painting from that time, which gives you a little illustration of what is really happening here. All right, and then to conclude that segment, we had talked about the imposition of this treaty, right? That is going to be imposed upon China. There are various consequences of this 19th treaty. You have the text of the treaty in front of you. In the reading that I sent to you, its various consequences are that number one, that Hong Kong is going to be ceded to the British in perpetuity, according to the terms of the treaty. And that is one reason why in 1997, when I think it was 97, when Hong Kong was reverted back to the PRC, to the People's Republic of China, it was such a large affair. That's one consequence. Their second consequence, which at that point is of much greater significance, because Hong Kong is really nothing at this point in time. It's going to become a major place over the years. But the more significant implication at that point was that there are what I call the treaty ports, 5 treaty ports, which are going to be opened up to the British. And once they're opened up to the British, we're going to find that over the decades, other European powers and eventually the United States are going to be able to take advantage of that as well. Right? Number 3, China has to pay reparations to Britain. And the treaty, I'm not going to discuss the details of that because the treaty outlines, you know, what portion of the reparations is for what purpose. The total amount of those reparations is about $21 million, which at that point in time is, of course, a very significant chunk of money. China is also going to be opened up to missionaries. It's going to be opened up to missionaries. And as Nehru says in the pages that you read, that each murder of a missionary becomes the occasion for demanding further privileges, because there's, of course, some resentment against allowing missionaries free reign in China. And, you know, if we had, let's say if this were a 3-quarter course, a year-long course, one of the segments we would certainly have looked at is missionary activity around the world in the 18th century leading into the early 20th century. Missionaries and, in fact, British subjects in general could not be subject to Chinese law, right? Which is exactly the sort of thing, by the way, that was happening in India, where, recall, the East India Company before 1857-58 is sovereign, and what was the criminal law of the day? If a Britisher killed an Indian, the Britisher could not be tried by Indians in an Indian court of law. It would have to be tried in a court which was under the jurisdiction of the company. And similarly in China, a Westerner could not be subjected to the Chinese law and Chinese courts. Right? So these are some of the consequences of the first Opium War. There is a second Opium War, which is in the 1850s. All the way into 1860, when the Summer Palace was destroyed by the British and the French. So, you know, if you've ever been to Beijing, I was there 2 years ago, I went to the Summer Palace, and it was the most astounding thing that I saw there, because one of the plaques that they have, so they've preserved the ruins, okay, of the old Summer Palace, and then there's a little plaque there. I meant to actually insert that slide in here. I think I'm going to do it when I get back and show it to you later on. But this plaque is basically a plaque which has been put up by the PRC government, basically giving a very brief history of the destruction of the Summer Palace, because it was an act of wanton destruction, right? It's an act of wanton destruction. And what this plaque says is that, you know, this is an eternal reminder to the Chinese of the humiliation imposed upon them by the European powers. Humiliation is a major force in history. I mean, you know, if we were to organize a world history course, which I'd love to do one day, just completely unpack the chronologies all together and simply do it around a set of ideas such as humiliation, pride, anger, envy. Right? One could do extraordinary things. Humiliation is a major force. Why do countries act the way they do? What were the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I? The fact that Germany experienced a kind of humiliation, right? Which then, of course, provokes the rearmament of Germany under, of course, Hitler and what is going to become the Nazi regime, right? And of course, one is not saying that that is the motor of history. I'm not suggesting that will explain everything. But what I'm saying is that there may be different ways of trying to think through some of the things in the course of world history, right? And one could try to organize it around it. So that's what's most striking is if you go to the Summer Palace, the old Summer Palace, and you really watch carefully, why have these ruins been preserved? Why do they have a plaque? Right? Okay? Because it is an eternal reminder to them of the humiliation, and therefore that they suffered, and therefore it's a suggestion that we are not going to allow ourselves to be subjected to such humiliation again. You know, right? That is, of course, the import of what is being suggested there. Now, we need to think about Japan as well. We haven't talked about Japan thus far. And of course, as we move into the late 1800s, early 1900s, Japan is going to become a major player. But again, I want to introduce that caution that I'd introduced before. I mean, it's unavoidable, this problem. And that is that when I say it's going to become a major player, well, it's going to become a major player because it's going to interact with the West. You know, right? Well, is that the only destiny that everyone else in the world has, that they become a major player only when they kind of interact with something called the West, right? Because of course all these countries have their own independent history, right? But this is the opening up of Japan that really brings it into the orbit of what is ordinarily called, you know, world history. Now we are going to just go back very briefly. Because there has been work done by a number of scholars which suggests that both Japan and China were actually in a position to make major advances, to become major players in 1600, for example, late 1500, 1600, and both countries, for various reasons, didn't do so. And I think that's important. There's a wonderful little book which I recommend very highly, which would be too much reading for this course, although it's a very short book, about 100 pages. It's called When Japan Gave Up the Sword by Noel Perret. And basically, what the book is about is why is it that Japan, which had the most superior military technology in many ways, circa 1600, decides that it's going to actually withdraw, right? This notion that every country is interested in adventurism, colonialism, this cannot be borne out by the facts of history. Yes, of course, Japan is going to become a major aggressive, indeed fascist power. In the early 20th century. Its invasion of China, occupation of Manchuria, and of course what's going to happen in the 1930s and 1940s all point to that. But that was not the nature of Japanese history in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. Right? So what do you have in Japan? What you have is you have a shogunate, you have a warrior class, so you know the emperor is basically a marginal figure, although the Japanese, you know, dynasty, imperial dynasty, has been around for a very long period of time. We're really going straight into the early 19th century. Because what's going to happen, remember that, you know, remember that I had mentioned very briefly to you that you have Commodore Perry, who's an American admiral who comes into the Bay of Tokyo in 1853 and threatens to bombard, you know, the city unless the Japanese open up their ports to trade. Because Japan at that point, the only place where there was any kind of European presence was actually in Nagasaki. That's a very old and interesting history where there had been a Dutch presence for some period of time. But other than that, you really didn't have any kind of European presence in Japan at all. Right? And so in 1853 is what is typically marked as the opening up of Japan. Now, before I get into the Meiji Restoration, as it's called, just a few comments. So the Tokugawa shogunate had been in control of Japan from 1603 to 1867, right? And it's after 1867 that Japan, quote, opens up in the sense of having what is called the Meiji Restoration. But one other little fact which is of some importance, namely that Japan becomes important to the US already by the 1850s, 1860s in a different way, and that is that Japan is a port of call. Port of call when, in particular, you have ships going from China to the United States, to the Pacific coast. And in 1868, there is a treaty that is negotiated. It's called the Burlingame Treaty. What does this treaty do in 1868? It allows for Chinese laborers to come to the United States. Right? So that's related now to the segment that we want to move into. That is a whole segment having to do with migration. But I'm saying that this is one of the reasons why Japan actually is going to become a little bit important. Now, when we speak about the Meiji Restoration, what are we talking about? Let's use a very different phrase. It's what you might call the modernization and westernization of Japan, which is going to commence in 1868. What are some of its aspects that we can think about? For example, the introduction of a parliamentary system, right? The parliament there is called the Diet, and like the British system, it has two houses. There's a lower house and there's an upper house. And I'm sure that some of you know that in Britain, unlike in the United States, I mean, you have two houses here as well. You've got the House of Representatives and you've got the Senate. You know that in the United States, of course, it's all by election. In Britain, you do not get elected to the House of Lords. That's the upper house. The lower house is the House of Commons, which is where bills are introduced, which is exactly the role played by the House of Representatives. You know, the bills are introduced in the House of Representatives, and then eventually they'll go to the Senate as well. In Britain, up to that point, you have a similarity in the parliamentary system. But the difference is that the House of Lords, you do not get elected to the House of Lords, you get nominated by the party that is in power, right? And those are the peers, the various people who get elected to the House of Lords are usually, you know, various kinds of peers, people who have done something, who have some significant achievement to their name, so forth and so on. That's the system. Now, that was essentially what was introduced in Japan. You had a lower house and you had a upper house. Beginning in 1884, people began to be elected to the lower house. Although the electorate in Japan at that time was only about 5%. 5%. Of course, in no country of the world was the electorate really more than about 25 to 30%, because women did not go anywhere at that juncture, right? And in most countries, voting rights, to the extent that they were permitted, were actually confined to males with property, right? Males with property. But in Japan, it's about 5%. The other significant thing to note about Japan is that Japan had a fairly high literacy rate already. right? By the late 19th century, certainly by far the highest literacy rate of any country in Asia. The only thing that would be comparable to that would be the literacy rate in Britain and in Germany. At that juncture, the United States is just a bit behind at that point in time. You also have an enormous growth of bureaucracy, because when we speak about the Meiji Restoration and when we speak about Westernization, what we're really talking about is a country that is now going to have the apparatus of a modern state, this is something that we're going to look at in greater detail later on, about how is it that states grow and the kinds of apparatuses that they're going to have. All right, and one of the apparatuses of the state, of course, is a bureaucracy. Right, the Japanese bureaucracy grows from about 29,000 men in roughly around 1890 to 72,000 in 1908. Right, which means, of course, that the government is also going to be one of the major employers at this point in time. It's very interesting. One of the major companies, Japanese companies, you hear about it a lot less today than you did even 20, 30 years ago. I'm talking about Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi, a huge company, an electronics giant, but a company that also was heavily invested in steel manufacturing and shipbuilding, all of that. Mitsubishi comes into existence in the late 19th century. So if you were doing a history of the modern corporation, you would certainly have to turn to Japan as well. Because by the late 19th century, I think the three countries where you would really have to turn your attention to if you were doing a history of the modern corporation would undoubtedly be Germany, the United States, and Japan. The person who founds Mitsubishi is a person who comes from this old samurai class. Now, one of the other aspects of the growth of Japan there is that essentially so it's called the Meiji Restoration because you have the restoration of the emperor, right? The Meiji emperor. The emperor had always been there, but effectively he had been sidelined for 250 years because Japan was really ruled by the shogunate, right? The Tokugawas. There's a wonderful film, feature film, which I cannot recommend too highly, by Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese filmmaker, called Kagemusha. Kagemusha, the Shadow Warrior. Extraordinary film, and if you want to get a sense of that ambiance of that time, 1600s, 1700s, I recommend that you see this film. So the emperor, 1868, is restored to his glory, which means that one of the things that's going to happen in Japan, I want to point to two tendencies here before I offer some closing comments on the Chinese-Japan section. Two tendencies. One, you have the cult of emperor worship. The cult of emperor worship. So the emperor is not simply now being restored to the throne. He had always been on the throne, except that the throne had been marginal for this period from the early 1600s until the late 1860s. The cult of emperor worship, to explain or to try to understand some of its consequences, I want to take you to 1945 for a moment. All right, you can look back then. What happens in 1945? Japan is defeated by the United States, and they're going to have what are called the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. Now, some of you may have heard of the Nuremberg trials, but you most likely have not heard of the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. What were the Nuremberg trials? The Nuremberg trials were that the Germans who had been defeated, the leadership of the Nazi Party and various other people who had occupied very high positions in Germany, including some corporate leaders, some of these people were going to be put on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are what are called the Nuremberg trials. All right? Now you have the counterpart of that for the Pacific, for war crimes committed by the Japanese. And these are called the Tokyo War Crime Trials. Right? Now, why am I mentioning all of this in connection with the emperor? Because one of the questions that came up, I'm writing a book on the Tokyo War Crime Trials, so this has been running in my head for a long time. right? One of the questions that comes up in 1945 is, should we try the emperor or not? So they had what were called the Class A criminal trials. So the Class A criminals are these criminals who are adjudged to be chiefly responsible for the atrocities committed by Japan during the war. But in the Japanese system, and this is where you have to go back to the 19th century. So what happens in the 1880s, 1890s, as Japan modernizes, the emperor is now the supreme commander. The military reports to him. He personally appoints the ministers in his cabinet, and like the German system, where you had a war staff, as it was called, in the Japanese system, the emperor personally appoints the commanders of the army, and they personally report to him. So, of course, in 1945, the argument that was given was that, well, of course, the emperor has to be put on trial, but this was the only thing that the Japanese would not agree to, because I don't know if all of you know the full story there, that after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and one of the reasons why the Americans claimed that this bombing was essential, we'll turn to all of that much later on in a few weeks from now, was because they had demanded an unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender from the Japanese. And one of the reasons why the Japanese were reluctant to do that is because they said, we have only one demand. The emperor should not be put on trial. Right? And so there's going to be a long, protracted discussion in American government circles. What do we do? Do we put him on trial or not? Because the Japanese said this would be the utter humiliation for us, and as a race we are doomed if the emperor is actually put on trial. So it's a very long, protracted discussion. Right? So now you understand the implications of what we're talking about when we're talking about the cult of emperor worship. Right? That the emperor is a divine figure. And so there's two trajectories, one that, the second, which is related but is separate, which I've already pointed to actually, and that is that the military system in Japan was in fact actually modeled after that of Germany. So you had a war staff, a general staff as it's called, German style, and these people would report directly to the emperor. All right? So now, if we think about China and Japan together in conjunction, right? Nehru, in the reading that I assigned to you, I think furnishes a very interesting argument there. Right? What is the nature of that argument that he furnishes? Let me just read from pages 456, 57, right, of the text that I assigned to you from Glimpses of World History. He says, nationalism and the cult of the divine emperor went side by side in Japan. Right? He's talking about Japan here. China, on the other hand, did not take readily to big machinery. But the Chinese, or at any rate modern China, welcomed Western thought and ideas and the scientific outlook. They were not so far removed from their own. Thus we see, and I'll rephrase all of this. Let me finish with the quote. Thus we see that although modern China entered more into the spirit of Western civilization, Japan outstripped her because she put on the armor of it, the veneer of it, ignoring the spirit. Japan not only followed Europe in industrial methods, but also in imperialistic aggression. She was more than a faithful spirit of the European powers. She often improved on them, end quote. Now, what is Nehru saying here? It's really quite a stunning argument, right? Because it helps us understand how countries dealt with Westernization in their own way. What he's saying very simply is the following. That if you look at Japan and China, so these two countries are comparable in the sense that they were both countries that were capable of being powers much earlier on. They both retreat inwards. They both become insular in some sense, isolated from the rest of the world in some respects, certainly, right? And then in the 19th century, we see both of them starting to interact with the West. But the nature of that interaction was very different. If you look at Japan, Japan seems to be much more westernized already by the 19th century, late 19th century, much more westernized. But Nehru is saying this is deceptive, because what they did was they copied the West, they imitated the West, they took on the veneer of the West, right? But in many respects, their soul remained Japanese. For example, the sense of Japanese aesthetics. They did not permit the West to penetrate in many ways into the inner core of their lives. They said, yeah, we'll take on the machinery, we'll take on the bureaucracy of the bureaucratic methods, the whole notion of modern administration, so forth and so on. All of this we will borrow from the West. Right? But we are not going to, in a sense, fundamentally allow this to penetrate our inner core. China, on the other hand, right, does not appear to be very westernized. So, for example, China is going to lag considerably behind Japan in the 19th century with respect to the adoption of modern military technology, modern methods of bureaucracy, right? Notions of administration. On the other hand, the Chinese, in fact, are engaging with Western thought in a much more serious fashion. And that's what Nehru is saying. That on the face of it, they look a lot less westernized, but there is a different kind of engagement with Western thought. The Japanese were not really engaging with Western thought in the same fashion. And that is essentially the argument, and you don't necessarily have to accept it, but this is the argument that Nehru is providing. And I think Nehru's insight into this is particularly interesting, because now you're talking about an intellectual of a third Asian country, namely India, right? And India, of course, also had gone through various processes of Westernization. So I think he's able to look upon this in a very different fashion. All right? So that pretty much brings me to an end with respect to this segment on China and Japan. We're obviously going to come back to Japan and China later on when we start looking at the relations between these two countries themselves and what's going to happen in the early 20th century. I want to turn to the whole segment of migration, global migration. And I want to begin actually with a slide about the contemporary world, about two diasporas. I will need to say something about the word diaspora, because we are here in this segment, we are not just looking at the 19th century. Yes, the empirical data will be drawn largely from the 19th century, but we're really speaking about a phenomenon that brings us to the present. I had fleetingly remarked, for example, that on I think at least one occasion, perhaps more than one occasion, that if you look at the world today, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, which is one of the various bodies of the United Nations, published a report very recently where they point out that at no time in history have there been a greater number of refugees than today. There are approximately 65 million people who are refugees today. And a refugee is a person who has fled from her or his home, usually under very precarious circumstances. Under very precarious circumstances. Now, refugees need to be distinguished from migrants in general. If you are living in Mexico and you're trying to cross the border and come into the U.S., you're not a refugee. You're a migrant. And I don't think, by the way, that we need to set up a hierarchy. Some people try to set up a hierarchy. Oh, well, we'll permit certain kind of people because, they are genuinely aspiring for something. The others have just come in because they've been forced. Well, if you are forced to flee, that's an extraordinarily traumatic moment in your life and the life of your family and your community, so forth and so on. I can tell you what my position is very simply so that you understand some of the perspective from which I'm speaking. I don't even recognize the presence of something called illegal immigrants. As far as I'm concerned, if you're here, you're here. I don't care whether you jumped from a mountain or swam or came with a ticket and a passport and a visa. This country is not any particular group of any particular ethnic community is to claim as its own. All right? And generally, I would argue that for migration anywhere. If there are people who are going, they are going for a reason. They're going for a reason. Yes?
What would you say then about India's policy of like Hindustan, like having like an entirely Indian nation, and that's not like close to like 98% population?
Can you just, I can't really hear you.
So for example, in India, they have like a policy of Hindustan. So just like a nation that's entirely Hindu.
Yeah.
And that's like literally in law constantly. And so essentially it's just kind of promoting people that are other race and religion.
Yeah.
You can't, we're saying you can live in this country,
Yeah.
but we do promote Hindu values, Hindu culture,
Oh,
Hindu
yeah.
religion.
Well, you know, look, I mean, the agenda of the Hindu nationalists is what you're really talking about.
Yeah.
I do not agree with their agenda at all. So I would not establish standards for this country that I would not want to establish for other countries, very simply. So, for example, if you're living in India and you happen to be a Muslim or you happen to be a Sikh, India has a population of approximately 200 million Muslims. Most of you will not be aware of that. 200 million Muslims live in India. As far as I'm concerned, they have every right of citizenship that anyone else has. It's as simple as that. You know. So I'm not establishing standards, as I said, which are particular for the U.S., although it must be said, and this is quite important, and this I started out with that observation, that the U.S. is in fact a country that by definition is a country of immigrants. So keeping anyone out of here in particular is an egregious error, and something that, at least from my point of view, is intolerable. Right? Intolerable. There are other countries where you can think about and you could say, oh, if you have a very small number of people in that country, let's say you're Norway or Sweden, all right, and you might say, well, the essential characteristics, and you know, you have unregulated migration, somewhat could plausibly argue that the entire character of that country could change overnight, right? But the question is that the essential character of this country is, in fact, a character shaped through immigration. And so in that respect, I would say that the burden on the U.S. to accept is even larger than it is on most other countries. And which is why I find completely intolerable the kinds of remarks that have been offered by the present administration where, you know, Mr. Trump talks about, oh, the country is being swamped by Syrian refugees. I mean, that's absolutely nonsense. I mean, nonsense is a polite word. I mean, that's an outright lie. Because, in fact, there are countries such as Jordan and Lebanon which have accepted huge number, willingly or unwillingly is another question, huge number of refugees. Okay? Jordan has over 1 million Syrian refugees at the moment. Okay? And Jordan is not a rich or large country, unlike the United States. So, you know, we could go on this forever, but I'm just saying, in principle, we need to think about, because we're going to be turning to the U.S. in the 19th century, what are the essential characteristics of American society, you know, and how was this country really shaped? What is it that makes some people think that they have an entitlement to this country? Which is what white supremacist theology, which is what it is, it's a theology, is based upon. This notion that somehow they have some special entitlement to this country. I think that that argument should be rejected with all the force that one can muster. You know. Right? But if you turn to the 19th century, we will see clearly some of the implications of this. However, let's start with this. The word diaspora, I've spoken about immigrants or migrants, I've spoken about refugees, I've spoken about global movement trends, as it were. Right? One of the words that you will encounter nowadays, which one did not really encounter 3-4 decades ago, is the word diaspora. Right? And this word was originally used, although that doesn't mean that that's the usage to which it is now captive? Of course not, because we speak about the Chinese and the Indian diaspora. This is what this slide is about. It's about two diasporas, the Chinese and the Indian diaspora. It's about 15 years old, this particular slide over here. But the word diaspora was originally used vis-a-vis the Jewish community. So the Jewish diaspora, because the word diaspora means dispersal, dispersal. And we know that the Jewish population was dispersed, right? And of course, there's a whole interesting argument to be made that that was in fact actually the nature of Jewish history. It's this dispersal. I mean, Israel in that sense is an anomaly, right? Because this has not been the nature of Jewish experience for, of course, a very long period of time. But let's leave that aside for a moment. Here we're looking at this idea of diasporas very briefly, because what we're talking about is what happens when people begin to disperse. And this is one way of understanding what's going to happen in the 19th century, because I think I had mentioned in a different context, perhaps when I was introducing the course in week 1, that if you look at the 19th century, you find, for example, that if you go to Jamaica, you go to Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Fiji, Mauritius, right? 6 countries I've mentioned here. 4 of these countries, the largest ethnic group in that country is Indians. Now, what are Indians doing in Mauritius? What are they doing in the Caribbean 10,000 miles away? Right? They are part of, today, what you call the diaspora. This is Indians who began to disperse. And that's, of course, what we're going to consider is what are the conditions under which they dispersed to other parts of the world. So here you can see, by the way, the orange-red circles. This is a Chinese outside the mainland. Look at the number of Chinese Thailand. We don't very often think about, you know. And if you read their article that you had by McEwen, kind of a dull article, frankly, but because it's just full of figures and statistics, but it gives you some sense of how many people are moving. How many people are moving? When he talks about 29 million Indians, well, where are they going to, right? And 19 million Chinese, and this is only those who went to Southeast Asia. We're not talking about all the Chinese and the Indians and the Burmese later on who went to Russia, to Siberia, okay? We're not talking about all those who went to the Americas, right? Just those 29 million Indians and 19 million Chinese. I'm just talking about Southeast Asia, right? Because you had over 10 million Indians who went to Burma, now called Myanmar, right? In the 19th century, until quite recently, that's what it's known as. But so, and you see Indonesia, 7.67 million, Thailand, 7.06. So this is all what you might in some ways describe also as a kind of a cynic sphere, right? This is where the Chinese made inroads in various kinds of ways, right? The green circles here indicate many of the places where the Indians. So this is what tells you, by the way, that these figures are very outdated, because it says 2.25 million Indians. Well, the number is closer to 4 million now. This was about 15 years ago. It's about 4 million Indians living in the United States today, and same thing with the Chinese. The numbers in the case of the Chinese have not gone up proportionately that much, but they're obviously higher than it used to be. And here you see Trinidad and Guyana, 2 places that I just mentioned to you, Mauritius. These are all countries which have predominantly Indian populations, right? So how did this happen? Let me take 5 minutes to describe the first of these 3 strands. The 2 other strands are immigration to the United States and to Brazil. But let me begin with Indian indentured labor, right? When I speak of indentured labor, the story essentially is the following. In the 1930s, you have the abolition of slavery in British colonies. In 1835, slavery was abolished in British colonies. Now, in the Caribbean, let's take that as our illustration. But later on, you're going to have Indian indentured labor going to Fiji, going to Malaysia. But we'll just take the Caribbean as an example, because that's where the migration, along with Mauritius. Mauritius is the other place where it started. in 1834 and starts in the Caribbean in the mid 1830s. And when I say the Caribbean, I'm talking about Trinidad and Tobago. I'm talking about Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana. Guyana is technically, of course, in South America, but it's the top portion. It's the top portion of it, so it's closer to the British Caribbean, and bordering Venezuela. And Suriname, right? So what happens here? These places, your basic crop is sugar cane, right? So you've got sugar plantations. That's what you have, effectively. When you have the abolition of slavery, the plantation owners have a problem on their hands. The problem on their hands is that they now need a labor force. The logical thing to do, I'm really simplifying here. I'm simplifying here because I could give you enormous detail of how the system worked, but just want to give you the bare bones of the story here. So for plantation owners, the fundamental problem is that now slavery has been abolished. The people who were working, of course, on these plantations were African slaves, right? And now, when slavery is abolished, you can go to the person who was working as your slave and say, will you still work for me? But this man or this woman is now, in principle, a free laborer. They set their own rate. The plantation owners were not willing to pay that rate. They thought it was too high. And so what did these plantation owners do? They basically, these are all British run, right? And so this is the British land-owning elite. It's the same land-owning elite which has also dispersed to some other parts of the world, including India, right? Including India. You know that story by now. The British have been in India for a long period of time, so on and so on. So these plantation owners will essentially get in touch with the government in London and say, would you interfere on our behalf and try to get a supply of labor from India? With the understanding, of course, that in India you had a large labor force. You had the surplus labor force. And this is essentially what is going to make possible what is called Indian indentured labor migration, right? So there are going to be a set of negotiations, and eventually there are going to be people who are going to leave from India. They're going to largely leave from Calcutta, on the East Coast, some of them from Madras, which is on the East Coast, but much further south, right? And one of the readings that was assigned to you is a book called Coolitude. You were assigned about 20, 30 pages from that book, because we know a number of things about the circumstances under which these people left. Number one, there is no question that there is an enormous economic depression in India. And this is something I have argued before, that if these people are willing to leave, and if they're willing to leave, and very often, by the way, they don't know where they are going, because the vast majority of these Indian indentured laborers are illiterate, And the farming working class in most countries in the world at that point is, of course, illiterate. In India, it is illiterate. And some of them come from the interior. They will eventually go to the port. They've been recruited by someone. Sometimes they have been misled. And they're told that, well, do you think you would want to have 6 months of work somewhere? And the person says yes. The next thing they know, they're on a boat. They might think they're only going for a day's ride somewhere. They're going to stay there. Well, the next thing they know, they're on the ship, and it's a 3-month journey. And of course, a good number of them are never going to make it there. They're going to die on the way. There's the problem of controlling diseases. If a person dies on the passage, you know what they did. They did exactly the same thing during what was called the Middle Passage, right? The Middle Passage, the passage which led Africans to be taken as slaves to the Americans. That if a person died on board, you just toss the body into the ocean. Right? There's no ceremony here, nothing of that kind. No dignity to the dead, nothing, of course. So that's the excerpts that you have are really about that. They're about the circumstances under which these people left. Why are they called indentured laborers? because indenture is a condition where you sign an agreement. And sign an agreement, you become indentured. It is, one historian argued, I'm not saying that I'm necessarily persuaded by that argument, but one historian very persuasively tried to argue that this was a new form of slavery. So they sign a 5-year contract, these Indians, and then they go to Trinidad with the understanding that after 5 years they might be able to come back, they're going to be paid some basic remuneration there, at least they're going to be able to survive. That is what is called Indian indentured migration, all right? And there are millions of Indians who are living under these circumstances. So we stop here and we pick up the narrative.